Hello, welcome. On the border between Samaria and Galilee, 10 men stood at a distance. They had been cut off from family, from worship, from the ordinary life they once knew. Their voices carried across the space they were not allowed to close. Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. He saw them. He spoke a simple command: go and show yourselves to the priests. They turned and began to walk, and as they went, the disease left them. Skin that had been marked became clean. Bodies that had been isolated were restored. 9 continued on their way. 1 turned back. He praised God with a loud voice, came to Jesus, threw himself at his feet, and gave thanks. He was a Samaritan, the one least expected to return, the one who had the farthest cultural distance to travel, and the one who did. Jesus asked where the other 9 were. Then he told the one who had come back that his faith had made him well. The story is not only about healing that reached the body, it is about the one who came back. 10 were cleansed on that road, only 1 returned, and the turning back, the loud praise, the thanks given at his feet became the moment the healing went all the way through. Jesus was traveling to Jerusalem, and the road he was walking ran along the border between Samaria and Galilee, a boundary that carried more than geographical significance. The border between Samaria and Galilee was the edge of 2 worlds that did not typically acknowledge each other. Jews and Samaritans had centuries of accumulated grievance between them, a history of religious division, ethnic contempt, and the particular bitterness that grows between communities who share enough common history to know exactly how much they disagree about what that history means. A Jew traveling through Samaritan territory did not linger. A Samaritan approaching a Jewish teacher did not expect a welcome. But the road Jesus was walking on that particular day would not respect those boundaries. And the 10 men he was about to encounter had already discovered, in the worst possible way, that suffering had its own way of dissolving the lines that ordinary social life maintained with such care. They stood at a distance. This detail was not incidental. It was the requirement of Mosaic law regarding those with leprosy, the requirement that they maintain a physical separation from the unaffected community, that they announce their condition to anyone who might approach them, that they live on the margins of the social world until a priest had declared them clean and the ritual procedures of restoration had been completed. The distance was not cruelty. It was the ancient world's understanding of public health operating within a religious framework that treated skin diseases as conditions of ceremonial uncleanness, requiring particular protocols for identification, isolation, and eventual restoration. But the effect of the distance, whatever its intention, was the sustained daily experience of being kept away, of watching the community from the margin, of calling out to announce a condition you did not choose, of existing in the particular loneliness of people who can see the world they used to inhabit but cannot re-enter it. 10 men stood at that distance, and in their standing together at the margin, the boundary that would have kept them apart under ordinary circumstances had been dissolved by the experience of sharing the same condition. Among them was a Samaritan. He stood with Jewish men he would never have approached under any other circumstances, bound to them by the solidarity of people who had all lost the same things to the same disease. Jesus, Master, have pity on us. The cry was collective. 10 voices at once. The direct, unadorned cry of people who had been reduced by their circumstance to the simplest possible expression of the only need that mattered: pity on us. Jesus looked at them, not through them, not past the distance that the law required them to maintain. At them, the full, personal, recognizing quality of attention that the 10 men at the margin had probably stopped expecting from people who passed along the road. Go, show yourselves to the priests. The instruction was precise and strange. Go, show yourselves to the priests. The protocol for the certification of cleansing, the presentation to the religious authority who had the power to declare a person officially restored to the community. But there was a problem with the instruction that anyone listening would have noticed immediately. They were not yet clean. The healing had not yet happened. Jesus was telling them to begin the journey of presenting their cleansing before the cleansing had occurred, to move toward the priests while the leprosy was still visibly present, to act on the declaration before the evidence supported it. And as they went, they were cleansed. The healing happened in the movement, not before the movement began, not as the condition for the movement starting. In the going itself, in the trusting, obedient action of people who had taken the word of Jesus seriously enough to act on it before the evidence had caught up with the declaration. 10 of them walked in the direction Jesus had sent them. 10 of them felt the change happening in their bodies as they walked. 10 of them arrived at a moment, somewhere along that road, in the middle of their obedient movement, when they understood that what Jesus had said had happened. The 9 and the 1. Here is where the story divides. 9 of them continued toward the priests. The instruction had been obeyed. The healing had occurred. The next logical step was the completion of the process Jesus had initiated, the presentation to the priests, the certification of cleansing, the formal restoration to the community that had been the entire content of their longing across however long they had been standing at the margin. The 9 were not wicked men. They were not ungrateful in any dramatic or obvious sense. They were people who had been given an instruction and were following it, who had received a healing and were completing the process that the healing required, who were doing exactly what Jesus had told them to do and would, presumably, have credited Jesus with the healing and spoken of him to the priests and to their families and to everyone who had known them at the margin. But they did not come back, and one did. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. The Samaritan, the one who had the least cultural reason to expect anything from a Jewish teacher, the one who stood at the margin of 2 different exclusions, the exclusion of leprosy and the exclusion of ethnic and religious contempt, the one who, by every social calculation available to the world he was moving through, should have been the least likely to receive the healing and the least likely to return and acknowledge it. He threw himself at Jesus' feet, not at a respectful distance, at his feet, the posture of a person who had abandoned every calculation of dignity and self-presentation in the moment that gratitude exceeded the capacity of ordinary social interaction to contain it, praising God in a loud voice, thanking Jesus, present with his whole self in the uncalculated, uninhibited expression of a person who had received something so far beyond what they had expected to receive that the ordinary mechanisms of social decorum were simply not large enough for the moment. Jesus asked 3 questions, each one more searching than the last. Were not all 10 cleansed? Yes. The healing was not partial. All 10 had received the same thing, the same miraculous cleansing, the same impossible restoration, the same gift that no medical intervention of the era could have produced, and that they had been carrying the absence of for however long the leprosy had kept them at the margin. Where are the other 9? The question was not angry. It was the honest, searching question of someone who had noticed something, who had given something significant to 10 people, and had watched 9 of them receive it without the return of acknowledgement that the size of the gift seemed to call for, not demanding gratitude as a transaction, noticing its absence with the honesty of someone who understood that the absence said something important about the condition of the heart that had received without returning. Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? The word foreigner carried the full weight of everything the Samaritan's presence at Jesus' feet represented. The one who had every social and religious reason to receive the gift with the least expectation and the least sense of entitlement was the one who had returned to offer the most personal, most embodied, most publicly uninhibited expression of gratitude. The one who had been excluded from 2 different communities simultaneously was the one who, in the moment of restoration, was most completely present at the feet of the one who had restored him. Jesus spoke to him and said, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." The word translated as well in this final sentence was not the same word used to describe the cleansing of the 10. The cleansing, katharizo, was the healing of the physical condition, the restoration of the skin, the removal of the disease that had kept all 10 men at the margin. All 10 had received this. The wellness Jesus declared over the one who returned, sozo, was something larger. It was the word for wholeness, for salvation, for the comprehensive restoration of a person at every level, physical, relational, spiritual, eternal. The healing had cleansed 10 bodies. The return had opened the door to something that the healing alone could not produce. The faith that had made him well was not the faith that had produced the healing. All 10 had gone when Jesus sent them. All 10 had received the cleansing. The faith that was honored in this final word was the faith that came back, the faith that recognized the source of the gift and was unwilling to receive it without bringing the recognition back to the one who had given it. 9 received a miracle. 1 received the miracle and the one who gave it. 9 were cleansed of leprosy. 1 was made wholly well. The difference was the return, and the return was the gratitude that the gift could not contain. Leprosy in the ancient world. To understand what Jesus did for the 10 men on the border between Samaria and Galilee, you need to understand what leprosy had done to them first, and what it meant in the social and religious framework of the world they were living in. The term translated as leprosy in the Gospel accounts covered a wider range of skin conditions than the modern medical definition of leprosy or Hansen's disease would include. It was the general designation for visible skin diseases that the Levitical law treated as conditions of ceremonial uncleanness, conditions that required the affected person to be separated from the community until a priest had examined them and declared them clean. The Levitical regulations for those with leprosy were careful and comprehensive. Leviticus 13 described in careful detail how a priest was to examine suspected cases, how to distinguish between conditions that required isolation and those that did not, and what the person declared unclean was required to do. They were to tear their clothes, leave their hair disheveled, cover their mouth, and call out, "Unclean, unclean," when anyone approached them. They were to live alone outside the camp for the duration of their condition. The isolation was not merely a public health measure. It was a religious and social displacement of the most total kind available to the ancient world. The person with leprosy was cut off from the community of worship, from the temple or the synagogue, from the shared life of the covenant people. They were outside in the most comprehensive sense, excluded from family, from community, from the structures of social belonging that gave life in the ancient world its meaning and its context. Restoration required a return to the priest. The careful process described in Leviticus 14, involving examination, declaration of cleansing, sacrifice, and ritual that extended across 8 days before the formerly leprous person was fully restored to community life. The priest did not heal. The priest declared what had already happened to be officially recognized. The pathway back to community ran through the religious authority whose declaration made the return possible. This is the framework within which Jesus' instruction to the 10, "Go, show yourselves to the priests," was immediately and clearly legible. He was pointing them toward the pathway back. The instruction was the invitation to begin the journey of restoration before the restoration was visible. The detail that the one who returned was a Samaritan was not incidental. Luke recorded it with the deliberate emphasis of a narrator who understood that this detail was the theological center of the passage. The relationship between Jews and Samaritans in the first century was one of the most sustained and most deeply felt ethnic and religious divisions in the world Jesus was navigating. The Samaritans were a mixed people descended from the intermarriage of Israelites who remained after the Assyrian conquest, with populations brought in from other regions, a heritage that the Jewish community of Jesus' day considered to have compromised the purity of the Israelite lineage and the integrity of the worship of God. The Samaritans maintained their own version of the Pentateuch and their own place of worship on Mount Gerizim rather than Jerusalem. The theological and ethnic contempt ran in both directions with the thoroughness of a division that had had centuries to develop its justifications. A Samaritan among the 10 lepers was in a double displacement. He was excluded from community by his disease and excluded from the full privileges of the covenant community by his ethnicity and religious background. He stood at the margin of 2 different exclusions simultaneously. That this man was the one who returned, who turned back when the 9 continued forward, who threw himself at the feet of a Jewish teacher in uninhibited gratitude, who offered the most complete and most embodied expression of thanksgiving in the entire account, was the theological statement that Luke was making visible through the detail of his identity. The gift of healing had crossed the boundary that separated Samaritan from Jew. The response of gratitude crossed it again in the other direction. The theological significance of Jesus' response to the Samaritan's return was contained in the distinction between the word he used for the cleansing of the 10 and the word he used for the wholeness he declared over the one. All 10 had been katharizo, cleansed, the word for the removal of the ceremonial uncleanness that leprosy had imposed. This was the miracle that had occurred as all 10 walked toward the priests in obedience to Jesus' instruction. It was real, complete, and equally distributed. There was no difference in the quality of the physical healing received by the 9 who continued and the one who returned. But over the one who returned, Jesus spoke a different word, sozo, the word for salvation, for wholeness, for the comprehensive restoration of a person at every level that the Greek term encompassed. The 9 received cleansing. The one who returned received something larger, the theologically freighted wholeness that the New Testament consistently associated with genuine encounter with God rather than simply the removal of a physical condition. The distinction was not a punishment of the 9 or a diminishment of what they had received. It was the identification of something the return had opened that the healing alone could not produce. The gift of healing, received and taken forward without the return of acknowledgement, remained a gift, but a gift that had not yet been met with the response that completed the encounter between the giver and the receiver. The return closed the loop. The gratitude brought the man back into the presence of the one who had healed him, and in that presence, at Jesus' feet, praising God in a loud voice, something was received that the continued journey to the priests could not provide, and that the 9 would not find at the end of their obedient compliance with the instruction. The early Christian communities that received and transmitted this account from Luke understood it as teaching something important about the shape of a complete response to the grace of God. The healing was the gift of God's mercy extended. The return was the faith that completed the reception of the gift, the active, embodied acknowledgement that the healing had a source who deserved the gratitude that the healing produced. Receiving mercy was not the end of the encounter. Turning back to give thanks was the movement that transformed the receipt of a miracle into genuine relationship with the one who performed it. This is the theological pattern that Luke was preserving in the account. The grace of God moves outward toward the unclean and the outsider without distinction. The response that completes the grace's work is the return, the turning back toward the source with the full weight of the gratitude that the gift deserves. 9 went forward in obedience, 1 went back in gratitude. Both movements were responses to what Jesus had done. Only one of them brought the person back to Jesus, and it was in the coming back that the one who returned received everything that was available to be received, not just the cleansed body, but the whole person, made well at every level by the faith that recognized the gift and returned to give glory to the one who gave it. When something significant and long-awaited finally arrives, when the thing that has been hoped for and prayed for and carried as an absence across months or years suddenly becomes present, the human mind does not naturally pause. It accelerates. The restoration of what was lost produces an immediate forward momentum, the urgent, entirely understandable movement toward everything that the absence had prevented. The person who receives unexpected good news does not typically sit with the news before moving toward the life the news makes newly available. They move immediately, with the urgency of someone who has been waiting at the margin for longer than they can remember, and who can now see the community they were excluded from at a distance that is finally closable. This is what the 9 did. They did not choose ingratitude over gratitude with conscious deliberation. They received the healing, felt the change in their bodies as they walked, and continued in the direction they had already been moving, toward the priests, toward the certification, toward the formal restoration that would open the door to everything the leprosy had closed. The momentum carried them past the gift toward the life the gift was giving them access to. This is not a moral failure. It is the entirely predictable behavior of people whose attention has been captured by the newly available future rather than the just received past. The Samaritan did something that required the interruption of exactly this forward momentum. He saw that he was healed, the same moment all 10 would have recognized, and then he reversed direction, turned back, retraced the steps that the healing had produced, returned to the source rather than continuing toward the destination. This deliberate turning back is what modern psychology identifies as the core behavior of genuine gratitude. And genuine gratitude, research consistently shows, produces outcomes that the mere receipt of good things does not. The psychological literature on gratitude has established with considerable consistency that the deliberate acknowledgement of a received benefit, the intentional act of turning toward the source of the gift and naming it as gift, produces measurable changes in the well-being of the person practicing it that the receipt of the benefit alone does not produce. People who practice gratitude deliberately report higher levels of life satisfaction, stronger social connection, greater resilience under pressure, and a reduced tendency toward the hedonic adaptation that causes good things to quickly lose their felt significance. The Samaritan who returned was not simply performing a social nicety. He was engaging in the deliberate act of attention that prevented the healing from becoming just another feature of the landscape, that kept the gift from dissolving into the background of the restored life it had made possible, and maintained the relationship between the receiver and the giver that the gift had opened. Jesus made a distinction that the passage was designed to illuminate. The 9 received cleansing, and the 1 received wellness. The Greek words were different, and the difference was theological and psychological simultaneously. Cleansing addressed the physical condition. The leprosy was gone. The skin was restored. The ceremonial uncleanness was removed. This was complete and real and equally distributed among all 10 men who had walked away at Jesus' word. Wellness, sozo, addressed something more comprehensive. It was the word that encompassed the full restoration of a person at every level: body, relationship, identity, soul. The Samaritan who returned with his whole being, voice raised, body prostrated, face at Jesus' feet, received this fuller restoration not because he performed a religious ritual, but because his return kept him in the presence of the one whose presence was itself the source of the wellness that the cleansing was pointing toward. The 9 had a restored body and an unchanged relationship with the one who healed them. The one who returned had both, the cleansed body and the deepened encounter with Jesus that the return had made possible. The psychological research on gratitude points consistently toward one of its most important effects. It keeps the person practicing it connected to the relationships and the sources from which their good things come. The person who moves quickly from received gift to next available benefit gradually loses the awareness of the gift's source. The connection between what they have and who provided it becomes invisible through the rapidity of the forward movement. The person who practices the deliberate turning back maintains that connection, and in maintaining it, maintains access to the relationship that the gift was always expressing. This is the psychological dimension of what Jesus named when he said, "Your faith has made you well." The faith that made him well was not separate from the gratitude that brought him back. The return was the faith, the embodied, costly, in-the-moment choice to interrupt the forward momentum and acknowledge the source before the momentum carried him past the capacity for acknowledgement entirely. The 9 were cleansed. The 1 was made well. The difference was the turning back, and the turning back was available to all 10. The 9 were not punished for failing to return. The text does not record Jesus rescinding the healing, does not describe the leprosy returning to the skin of those who continued toward the priests without looking back. The cleansing was complete and remained complete. The gift was given and stayed given regardless of whether the giving was acknowledged. This is the first and most important thing to understand about the damage that the 9 experienced. It was not the loss of what they had received. It was the loss of what the return would have added to what they had received. And that loss, while invisible in the moment of the forward momentum that carried them past the opportunity, was real and significant in ways that the healed skin could not compensate for. The 9 received a miracle and missed an encounter. They received the cleansing and did not receive the one who cleansed them. They received the removal of the condition that had kept them at the margin and did not receive the wholeness that only the presence of Jesus could provide. They arrived at the priests with restored bodies and unchanged hearts, people whose circumstances had been transformed by a grace whose source they had not returned to acknowledge. The damage that unacknowledged mercy produces in the human heart is not the dramatic damage of obvious ingratitude. It is the quiet, invisible damage of a heart that has received from God without the return of attention toward God, that has been touched by grace without the touching reorganizing the direction of travel. The 9 continued in the direction they had been going before the healing. The healing removed an obstacle from the path they were already on. It did not change the path, because the changing of the path required the return, the falling at the feet, the moment of encounter that the forward momentum had prevented. This is the theological and psychological harm of the received but unacknowledged gift. It becomes simply the newest feature of the landscape of a life whose direction the gift did not interrupt. The mercy is present. The transformation of the direction that the mercy should have produced is absent. The heart moves on, now with better circumstances, but not with the fundamental reorientation that the return to Jesus and the prostration at his feet would have produced. The 9 were healed, but the one who returned received something the 9 did not because the gift was withheld from the 9, but because the completed response to the gift opens something that the incomplete response cannot access. They missed the feet of Jesus, and everything that falling at those feet would have meant for the direction of everything that followed. The Samaritan was cleansed at the same moment as the other 9. The healing was identical in its physical expression. the same impossible restoration of skin, the same removal of the condition that had kept him at the margin, the same gift distributed equally among 10 men who had called out together from the required distance. What was not identical was what happened next. The 9 received the healing and continued in the direction they were already traveling. The 1 received the healing and turned around, and in the turning, something began that the healing had made possible but could not by itself produce. The transformation was visible in the sequence of what happened when he returned. He came back praising God in a loud voice, the uninhibited, publicly expressed recognition that what had happened to him had a source who was worthy of the fullest response his voice and his body could produce. He threw himself at Jesus' feet, the posture of someone who had abandoned every calculation of dignity in the moment that gratitude exceeded the capacity of ordinary interaction to contain. He thanked him. 3 movements: praise, prostration, thanks, each one a dimension of the complete response that the gift had called for, the whole person brought back to the whole presence of the one who had given the whole gift. And then Jesus spoke the word that identified what the return had produced beyond the cleansing. Your faith has made you well. The wholeness declared over him was not a different physical healing. It was the comprehensive restoration of a person who had been encountered by grace and had allowed the encounter to complete itself, who had let the gift lead him back to the giver rather than simply forward into the life the gift made newly available. The transformation that the Samaritan's return produced was not primarily emotional, the warm feeling of a grateful person expressing their appreciation before moving on. It was relational and directional, the reorientation of a person whose encounter with Jesus had not been left incomplete at the moment of the healing, but had been brought to its fullest possible expression at the moment of the return. The 9 had an encounter with Jesus that ended on the road when the healing occurred, and the forward momentum carried them past the source of what they had received. The 1 had an encounter with Jesus that arrived at its deepest point only when he turned back, when the forward momentum was interrupted and the relationship between the receiver and the giver was given the space to become what the healing had been inviting it to become. This is the transformation that every story of genuine thanksgiving replicates, the moment when the received gift leads back to the giver rather than simply forward into the improved life the gift produces. The moment when the mercy received becomes the reason for the return rather than simply the occasion for the departure. The people who followed the Samaritan's pattern, who received grace and turned back rather than forward, who allowed the gift to bring them to the feet of the one who gave it before carrying them into the life it had opened, described a consistent experience of something the 9 did not find on their road to the priests. Not better circumstances, fuller presence, not improved conditions, genuine wholeness, the comprehensive sozo wellness that Jesus declared over the one who had returned, and that the return itself had been the pathway toward. The healing opened the road, the return opened the relationship, and the relationship was the transformation that the healing was always pointing toward. The most immediate practical response to Luke 17:11-19 is the simplest and the most easily neglected. When you receive something good, stop before you continue. The 9 were not wicked. they were moving. The forward momentum of restored life carried them past the source of the restoration before the gratitude could organize itself into the return. The practical discipline that the Samaritan's example calls for is the deliberate interruption of exactly this momentum, the daily, returning practice of pausing at the point of received grace before moving forward into the life the grace has made newly available. This does not require a long pause. It requires a genuine one. The moment of honest recognition that something good has arrived, followed by the deliberate turning of attention back toward the source before the forward momentum has carried attention fully past it. Name what was received. Speak the thanks aloud if that helps make it real. The Samaritan came back praising God in a loud voice. The public, embodied, whole-person expression of gratitude that the gift deserved rather than the interior acknowledgement that could remain safely private. There is something about the voiced thanks, the gratitude that exits the body and enters the world as sound, that prevents the acknowledgement from remaining theoretical. Then stay at the feet long enough for the encounter to be complete. Not the hurried thanks of someone checking gratitude off a list before moving on. The deliberate, present, full attention offering of a person who has brought their whole self back to the one who gave the gift. The Samaritan's return was dramatic because the gift was dramatic. The restoration of a life that leprosy had confined to the margin. But the discipline of turning back is most effectively built in the ordinary, undramatic, daily moments when smaller gifts arrive and the forward momentum of ordinary life makes the pause feel unnecessary. The meal that arrived, the health that continued without crisis, the relationship that sustained itself through a difficult season, the morning that came after the night that felt impossible. These are the ordinary gifts that build the habit of return when practiced with the same deliberate attention that the extraordinary gift deserved. The person who has practiced turning back for the small gifts arrives at the large ones already formed in the direction of return, already shaped by the daily discipline of the pause and the thanks, and the remaining at the feet long enough for the encounter to be complete. The gratitude does not have to be constructed in the moment of the large gift. It flows from the pattern that the small gifts have been building. Begin today with whatever arrived today. The gift does not need to be extraordinary for the thanks to be genuine. The Samaritan came back alone. The 9 did not accompany him. The return was his individual choice in a moment when the group's collective momentum was carrying everyone in the other direction. But the communities that shared and transmitted this story understood it as an invitation to collective gratitude, the practice of turning back together, of naming received mercies in the presence of one another, of building into the shared life of a community the regular, deliberate acknowledgement of gifts that the forward momentum of busy lives could otherwise carry everyone past without pausing. Practice this in your household. Name the gifts at the table before the meal moves into the next item of the evening. Practice it in your community, the shared acknowledgement of grace received, offered in the presence of people who are also learning the discipline of the return. When blessings arrive and thanks is delayed, when the forward momentum has already carried you some distance past the gift before you noticed the passing, return anyway. The 9 had already covered significant ground when the Samaritan turned back. The return is still available after the momentum has built. It is simply more costly to interrupt. Interrupt it anyway. Turn back. Give thanks with a loud voice, and let the gratitude lead you back to the feet of the one who gave the gift, where the one who returned discovered that what was available there was more than the cleansing, and more than the restored life the cleansing made possible. Your faith has made you well. 10 men stood at a distance and called out together. One name, one request. 10 voices from the margin of everything they had been excluded from, the community, the worship, the ordinary life that leprosy had placed behind a distance the law required them to maintain. Jesus heard them, sent them, healed them on the road, and 9 of them kept walking. 1 turned back, not because he was more deserving, not because his healing was incomplete or his restoration was conditional on the return. He turned back because the gift had done something in him that the forward momentum of restored life could not contain, had produced a gratitude that exceeded the capacity of the continued journey to hold, that asked to be brought back to the one from whom the gift had come before anything else was done with the life the gift had given back. He fell at the feet of Jesus, praised God in a loud voice, gave thanks, and Jesus looked at him and spoke the word that the 9 would not hear on the road to the priests, the word that was larger than cleansing, larger than restored skin, larger than the formal certification that would open the door back to everything leprosy had closed. Your faith has made you well. 10 received a miracle. 1 received the miracle and the miracle worker. 10 were cleansed of leprosy. 1 was made wholly well. The difference was the return, and the return is still available. Rest well.